So in addressing this idea of heaven as a misunderstood word, this is something that Swedenborg himself addresses head-on in his teachings, and he does so at the beginning of the book called Conjugial Love. There is a lovely little chapter there where he describes, in his own words, seeing groups of people describing their idea of what heaven is and having opportunity to explore that and understand what it's all about. And so I thought what I would do is just begin by starting to read that. I certainly don't want to read the whole thing. And so he then goes on to describe this meeting of these groups of people. And that's what we're going to have a little bit of a look at this morning. So we have the angel from the east who comes and makes this proclamation. And we find that there are two groups who come from the northern quarters, two groups that come from the west, and two groups that come from the south. So the two groups that come from the north, the first group, it's all about being admitted. Their concept of heaven is simply being admitted to heaven, nothing more. It's a very, very simple idea. The second group from the north are interested in stimulating conversation. So they imagine that that's what heaven is like, just being amongst a variety of different groups, and we learn a great deal from one another in our conversation with one another. Then the two groups from the west. The first group talk about dining and entertainment. They're particularly focused on dining with Abraham, Isaac and Jacob and the 12 apostles, but it also speaks about these entertainments that take place during all of these meals, and they're rotating around these tables as they go through this idea of heaven. The second group from the west talk about living in a beautiful garden, simply being able to wander around in nature and enjoy the sights, enjoy lovely company, enjoy beautiful foods and fruits and so on. The next two groups from the south. The first one talks about being crowned as kings and princes, sitting on thrones and having their every desire waited upon them hand and foot. And the last group, the second group from the south, talk about heaven as everlasting worship, going to an eternal church service. What I find really interesting about all of this is we have 6 groups, 6 different perspectives on what makes heaven. And hidden away at the back of the description, there's a 7th group. And the 7th group are angels from the east who already live within heaven. They understand what heaven is, and it is their very existence. That creates something quite interesting. We have these 6 false ideas of heaven and one true idea of heaven, and that makes me think of the creation story. 6 days of work and 1 day of rest. Just something interesting to note. But notice also the fact that these groups are in pairs. And whenever pairs are spoken of in the word, we think of good and truth. 2 different sides of more or less the same sort of attitude. And then when we think of the quarters from which each of these ideas come from, the north as being a more naturally based knowledge, and because of that it is in relative obscurity. It's an unclear idea, only a vague idea of what heaven might be like. That's the north. The west, being the opposite pole from the east, and we think of the east as where the Lord is, the rising sun. So many Christian churches are built facing east. Temples are built facing east. So the east represents where the Lord is and where heaven is. The west represents worldly pleasures. Okay, again, it's a worldly idea, but it's centered on this idea of something enjoyable, something that we love to do. And the south often refers to a kind of a wisdom, a deeper sense of something, as I say, opposite to the north, which is more obscure. This is something that is more wise, more intelligent. But notice in this case, of course, it's not the true ideal of heaven. It's still a misrepresentation of what heaven is. So these are the groups as they're presented at the beginning of the story. But then I find it interesting the way in which he then relays each group as it experiences their heaven, because he doesn't start with the first group. The first group to experience their heaven are the group who think it is stimulating conversation. So these people are ushered into this situation where it's more or less like a large party, and there are many rooms and there are many discussions and conversations going on, and Swedenborg and this group get to see these people experiencing their heaven, but they come through and they find a group who are sitting at the door waiting to be let out. And because they're miserable, they're bored with all of this now. They don't really get any sense of pleasure from it. And the lesson that the angels teach this group is essentially that heaven is the pleasure of doing something which is of service to oneself and to others. In other words, you can learn all you like, but unless you apply it to your life, it's useless. The second group that get to experience their heaven are the dining, those who dine with Abraham, Isaac and Jacob and the apostles. And of course you can imagine sitting in an endless feast and simply rotating from one table to the next and having lovely entertainments and bands and dances between each table. As with most things, if you have enough of something, you're going to get bored with it, and that's what happens. And so his point here is that heavenly food is love, wisdom, and service. Again, this idea of service comes in. And it reminds me of what Jesus says in John's Gospel in chapter 4. He says, "My food is to do the will of him who sent me and to finish his work." The next group to experience their heaven are those crowned as kings and princes. This is unusual, this group, because it's cut short. They don't actually get to the point where they get bored of their heaven. They're only allowed to be in this state for 3 hours. And after 3 hours, a voice comes from heaven and says, "Look at you, you're all play acting. That you're actually doing nothing. You say that you think you have power, but there's nothing going on here. You're just sitting, dressed in costumes, looking foolish." And again, the idea is that heaven is not being in a position of power, but it's actually serving. It's serving the uses of others. Again, Matthew's Gospel, chapter 20, the Lord said, "The Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve." The next group is the group in the garden. And this is an interesting comment that's made to this group once they discover, ultimately the same thing. As I said before, enough of the same thing is pretty boring. It says, "There is no outward delight in gardens unless this is accompanied by inward delight in gardens. The outward delights are only delights of the bodily senses, but inward delights are delights of the affections of the soul." So we get a slightly different idea here. The understanding that delight is within. It is not experienced out there in the world. It's something that we must have within us. So that's another nuance to this picture that's being offered here. Then we have my favourite. This is my favourite group because it's so funny, I think. The idea that heaven is an endless church service. It doesn't take much imagining, does it, to realise that you're beating the door down. It doesn't take 3 days, but they're allowed to be there for 3 days to experience it. And this group are told, glorifying God means bringing forth the fruits of love, that is, faithfully, honestly and painstakingly doing the work demanded by one's occupation. This is what glorifying God means. It's being of use again, isn't it? And this I also find interesting. The last group to experience their heaven are the people who've been waiting to be let in. They are made to wait to be the last group to experience their heaven. And in actual fact, they don't go anywhere. All of these other groups have been led off somewhere, and this group have sat and watched while all the other groups have gone to experience their heaven. And they don't go anywhere. Someone comes to them and explains their folly. And it says, the joys of heaven and eternal happiness do not have to do with location, but with the state of a person's life, from love and wisdom. What I want to just say in summary is a couple of things. Heaven is not a place. Heaven is deriving true satisfaction from being of use, being invested in some active purpose. It's a pleasure of the whole being, inner and outer, not just bodily pleasures and bodily delights. And it's the heart and the mind united together, working together, not just the body. And it has what is good and true from the Lord at the centre of what it does. That is heaven. Now, we were talking about it at Connect the other week. And one of the comments that was made was, if there is a life after death, then it makes sense in this world to prepare for heaven. Because if we prepare for heaven and there isn't life after death, then we're not going to know that it's not there. We're not going to miss it. Whereas if we live our life thinking that there's not a heaven and there is, and we haven't prepared for it, then we're in a worse situation. That was the point that was made. In actual fact, the thing we need to realise is the person who prepares for heaven is the person who makes this life better as well. So there's an additional reason for doing that preparation. That the very things that make heaven in us are the things that make this life better. So we don't need to wait for the next life to experience heaven, and in fact we can't. And Swedenborg writes this. This is from Heavenly Secrets. All who receive love and faith from the Lord have heaven residing in them. People, therefore, who have heaven within themselves while they are living in the world enter heaven after death. We can't wait for it. We have to enact it and experience it to some extent here. And that's a sobering message. I do also want to dwell on an application of this. And I want to say before I say anything else that this is very much based on my own personal experience. Because what I say, you might think, oh, I'm pointing the finger at you. I'm not. I'm just saying this is an experience I've had, and I think we all have it. And it's the idea of attributing motive. This is one of the ways that Swedenborg talks about engaging in the life of heaven here and now. He says, people with whom faith is separated from charity see nothing else but errors and perversities residing with other people. But those who have faith that dwells in charity are different. They notice the goods. And if they do see evils and falsities, they excuse them. And if possible, endeavour with that person to correct them. So often we look out at the world, we look at other people, we see something we don't like, And almost instantly we explain it to ourselves, and we're very good at explaining it in negative ways because we don't happen to like that particular action or attitude or whatever it is we're seeing. Swedenborg turns it on its head. What he's saying in this passage is the problem's not out there, the problem's in here. I am seeing that out in the world and I'm unable to explain it in a positive way because heaven doesn't exist here. And how important it is for us to find that heavenly state within ourselves in all the ways that we react and interact with others in the world. I discovered a few weeks ago this actually has a basis in cognitive psychology. And it's called the fundamental attribution error. It's a well-documented phenomena. We tend to attribute others' negative behaviours to their inherent personality or character, their inner world, while attributing our own negative behaviours to situational factors or our outer world circumstances. Do you see how we deal with that? And we've got to flip that on its head. We've got to see it in different ways. We've got to be prepared to offer another person an excuse, even if only mentally, in the way that we interact with them. So there's your challenge for the week. If you find people that you interact with who do things that you don't like or you don't understand, can you provide for them, at least in your own mind, some extenuating circumstances or some other motivation than what your mind instantly offers to you? It's a real challenge. As I say, it's one that I've experienced myself, and I know that when we get into that negative mindset, it doesn't help us deal with those people constructively.